The house was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. I still remember the glow of the hallway lamp catching the edge of my daughter's coat as she stood with her back to me, speaking in a low, steady voice about a trip to Alaska and an accident that would solve everything. My breath froze before the winter air ever could. If you've ever trusted someone so deeply that the truth nearly broke you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because moments like this are far more real than we admit. I stood there, listening to the person I loved most map out the end of my life, and all I could think was how none of it felt real. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I still remember the way the house felt that afternoon. Quiet, warm, familiar. I walked in expecting nothing more than a late cup of tea and a moment to rest my feet. Instead, I stepped into a nightmare I never imagined would come from my own child. I heard my daughter's voice drifting from the kitchen, calm and steady, talking about an upcoming winter trip we had planned together. At first, I thought she was chatting with a friend about travel details, but then the words shifted, and suddenly she was talking about how easy it would be if an accident happened out there, how the ice, the cold, and the isolation could make everything look natural. I froze in place. My mind refused to accept what my ears were hearing. She spoke about me as though I were already gone. There was no tremor in her voice, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that cut deeper than any blade could. I stood there with my hand on the wall, staring at nothing, trying to breathe through the shock. I remember thinking that maybe I misunderstood, that maybe stress had twisted her tone. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. My own daughter had decided my life was worth more to her gone than here. The room felt smaller, the air colder. I backed away before she could see me, terrified she'd hear the shaking in my breath. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life cracked open, and as I stood there, trying to steady myself, one thought kept echoing in my mind. I wasn't always this frightened. I wasn't always living in the shadow of my own child. There was a life before this, before betrayal rewrote everything I thought was true. Before all of this, my life in Portland. Maine was quiet in a way that felt earned. After my husband passed, I tried to keep myself steady by holding on to small routines, watering the plants every morning, walking the same trail near the bay, keeping his old flannel folded at the foot of the bed. Grief had softened into something manageable, something I could live beside without drowning in it. And through all of that, I believed Emily was my anchor. She visited often, always with a warm smile, always with soft concern in her voice. I truly thought she was the one person I could lean on without hesitation. Her family brought brightness into my days. My grandchildren would run through my living room with their backpacks half open, telling me stories about school, handing me drawings they insisted I frame. I felt needed, loved, woven into something still hopeful. So when Emily suggested a winter trip to Juneau, a chance for me to see something new, to breathe different air, to shake the loneliness that sometimes crept in, I accepted with a full heart. I thought it was her way of lifting me up. Looking back now, I can see how open I was, how grateful I felt for anything that resembled care. That vulnerability made what I overheard even harder to swallow. The warmth I relied on suddenly feels like a mask I never knew she wore. And as that realization settles deeper, I can feel the unraveling begin, pulling me toward truths I never wanted to face. When I stepped back into the house that evening, still shaken from what I had overheard, the reality of it all settled over me like a weight I couldn't lift. At first, I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation, that maybe I had misheard or misunderstood or let grief and loneliness distort everything. But the more I replayed her words in my mind, the clearer it became. Emily wasn't panicked. She wasn't overwhelmed or confused. She was calm, certain, planning. That certainty is what broke me. A few minutes later, she walked into the living room with that bright, practiced warmth she always carried. She asked how my day had been and smiled at me as though nothing dark had ever touched her thoughts. Watching her move through the room so casually felt like standing in front of a stranger who happened to have my daughter's face. I nodded, answered softly, pretended I didn't feel the ground shifting under me. And as I watched her, all the small things I had brushed aside over the past year started sliding into place. The tension in her marriage, the quiet arguments about money, the way she had begun to treat me like a responsibility instead of a person. Even her sudden insistence on this winter trip, something she said would bring us closer, took on a chilling new shape. Inside, fear was rising fast, pressing against my ribs, but I forced my hands to stay steady. I knew if I confronted her in that moment, I wouldn't survive whatever she had already set in motion. I had to stay quiet. I had to act normal. And as that realization settled in, another followed right behind it if I wanted to live. I needed to understand exactly what she was planning, and I needed to start preparing my own plan in return. The morning after I overheard Emily's plans, I woke with a clarity that felt foreign. Fear was still there, sitting heavy in my chest, but something sharper had risen beside it, a need to understand exactly what she intended to do. I left the house early and walked to the public library, moving quietly, trying not to draw attention. I spent hours reading about winter accidents in Alaska, the way ice can crack without warning, how fast hypothermia can take hold, how often people simply vanish into the wilderness with no trace. Every article felt like a mirror held up to a future someone else had chosen for me. Seeing my own potential death spelled out in cold, clinical paragraphs was more grounding than I expected. It made the danger real. I knew I needed advice. So I visited Jonathan Pierce, an old colleague of my husband's. The moment he saw me, his face tightened with worry. I told him what I could without revealing the whole truth, and his hesitation said everything. Without evidence, no officer, no judge, no authority would believe I was in danger from my own daughter. They would chalk it up to age, grief, or confusion. Walking out of his office, that reality settled over me like a second skin. No one was coming to save me. So I started digging into the details of the guide Emily had chosen, Cole Harding. It didn't take long to uncover the truth: an overdue gambling debt and a debt collector known for using pressure. It became painfully clear Emily was using that weakness to force him into her plan. But that weakness gave me something to leverage. In that moment, I realized I couldn't run from the trip. I had to go. But I would go on my own terms, with a plan built on understanding every piece of hers. And the first step was meeting Cole face to face. I reached the hotel cafe near the Portland airport just after 2:30 p.m. My hands wrapped tightly around the straps of my purse to steady the trembling I didn't want anyone to see. Cole Harding was already there, sitting in a corner booth, his shoulders tense and his eyes fixed on the door as though he expected danger to walk in behind me. In a way, it did. My presence threatened the plan he'd agreed to, the one he was being squeezed into by someone who should have been protecting me. When I sat down across from him, I forced my posture to stay calm, even though my heartbeat felt uneven in my chest. He barely met my eyes. There was guilt in the tight way he held his jaw, and fear too. Fear that I knew something, or worse, everything. For a few moments, we sat in a silence that felt heavier than words. I finally told him what he needed to hear, that I knew about the gambling debt, the calls from men who didn't make idle threats, and the way Emily had used that desperation to trap him. His expression shifted in an instant. Shock, then shame, then a kind of weary relief that someone finally saw him clearly. I told him I wasn't there to beg or plead. I was there to offer him a way out. $50,000, enough to clear his debt, enough to start over, if he helped me disappear instead of die. Saying it out loud made my breath hitch. I was placing my life in the hands of a stranger who had once agreed to harm me. He sat back, rubbed his face, and after a long, shaking exhale, he nodded. It wasn't confidence. It was surrender. And in that moment, I understood that our fragile alliance was the thin line between my death and my survival. Ahead of us was Alaska, and the staged accident that would change everything. The flight into Juneau felt unreal, as though I were watching someone else's life unfold from behind a pane of glass. The mountains looked carved from ice and shadow, rising straight out of the water, beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. I pressed my forehead to the window, trying to breathe through the weight of what waited for me here. This place, this breathtaking, frozen world, was where my daughter intended my life to end. And yet, it was also where I planned to take it back. Cole met me at the small airport with a polite, distant smile. Anyone watching would have seen nothing more than a guide greeting a client. We talked about the weather and the trail conditions, each of us reciting lines we had silently rehearsed. Underneath his steady posture, I sensed the fear, the guilt, the pressure. Underneath my own smile, I felt a constant thrum of dread, wondering if Emily had arranged other pieces I hadn't yet discovered. Someone watching, someone recording, someone ready to intervene if the plan wavered. During the day, I walked through downtown Juneau, pretending to be a tourist. I watched the fishing boats move across the channel, listened to the crunch of snow under my boots, and tried to memorize the ordinary world around me in case it was the last time I saw it. In the evenings, I returned to my hotel room and placed small pieces of my old life around the space. Letters to my grandchildren, a few unfinished journal pages, and belongings arranged just untidy enough to suggest a woman struggling emotionally. Every item felt like a surrender, a quiet dismantling of who I had been. By nightfall, the sky shifted into a deep, cold blue. Cole knocked softly, signaling that it was time. As I bundled myself in layers and followed him out toward the frozen lake, the aurora beginning to shimmer overhead, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I was walking toward danger, toward the end of the life everyone thought they knew. But for the first time, It was on my terms. The cold hit me the moment I stepped out of the truck, sharp enough to steal my breath. The lake stretched out in front of me like a sheet of black glass, framed by snow-covered pines. Overhead, the aurora moved in slow ribbons of green and violet, beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. Cole walked a few steps ahead, his boots crunching steadily while mine felt heavier with every step. I kept telling myself to remember the plan, to breathe, to move with purpose. When we reached the marked spot, I felt my chest tighten. This was where my old life would end. I took one last look at the sky before letting my foot slide forward, making my fall look clumsy, accidental. I dropped toward the edge, then slipped behind the rocks where the shadows swallowed me. A moment later, Cole's voice rose across the ice, raw panic practiced to perfection as he shouted for help that he knew would never reach me. I crawled deeper into the hidden space where we had stored the supplies. The cold seeped into my bones, and for a moment I felt hollow, like I was listening to a eulogy meant for someone I hadn't fully accepted was me. I heard distant footsteps, people searching, calling my name, their voices floating over the lake like echoes from another lifetime. When the noise finally faded, I stood, pulled my pack over my shoulders, and began walking toward the small shelter miles away. Each step felt like shedding another layer of the woman the world believed had died. There was no turning back now. Soon, I would see who my daughter became when she thought I was gone. I was sitting alone in that tiny Alaskan cabin, wrapped in a blanket that never seemed warm enough. When the investigator's first update reached me, he told me Emily had just received the call about my death. For a moment, I held my breath, waiting for some sign of shock or grief. Instead, he said she smiled. Not a fragile, grief-strained smile, a genuine flicker of relief. Hearing that felt like being struck in the chest. The updates kept coming, steady and brutal. Within hours, she contacted the insurance office. By the next morning, she was asking about the timeline for releasing funds and discussing how quickly she could sell my home. He said she spoke in a calm, businesslike tone, as if she were managing a routine transaction rather than the loss of her mother. Each detail felt colder than the one before it. What hurt most was hearing about the kids. My grandchildren cried in their rooms, clutching old photographs or hiding under blankets, because the world suddenly felt unsafe. They asked why I left without saying goodbye, and Emily told them I had been confused for months, claiming I misplaced heirlooms she had already thrown out. When the investigator said she tossed the quilt my husband and I stitched together during his last winter, something inside me fractured. That quilt carried the story of our life, and she treated it like clutter. Yet beneath the heartbreak, something steadier began to rise. Every choice she made revealed exactly who she had become. Every lie, every discarded memory, every rushed call told me the truth I had been too afraid to face. I realized then that disappearing wasn't enough. I knew what had to happen next. It was time to return from the dead. I woke up in the cabin before sunrise, the kind of cold, blue quiet that makes every breath feel heavier. I knew the waiting was over. Emily had shown me everything I needed to see. It was time to step back into a world that believed I was gone. I packed only what my new identity required and slipped out into the early morning. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked toward the small road where Cole would leave the car. There was no ceremony, No last look behind me. Just the steady understanding that the woman who arrived here would never be the one who walked out. Traveling under a different name felt strange, almost dreamlike. I moved through the Juneau airport unnoticed, surrounded by people who would never imagine that the woman on the missing persons report was standing beside them in the security line. On the plane, back to the lower 48, I stared out at the clouds and tried to feel alive again. Grief and anger moved through me in quiet waves, but beneath it all was something clearer purpose. When I finally met with my attorney and the detective in a private office, their faces held both relief and disbelief. I told them everything, laying out the truth I had carried alone. Hearing my own voice describe my death made my hands tremble. But I kept going. I had to. Walking out into the evening air afterward, I felt the full weight of what came next. Revealing myself would shatter whatever was left of my family. But there was no other path. It was time to face the aftermath and the courtroom that waited for all of us. When I walked into the police station to identify myself, the entire room went silent. Officers stared at me as if a ghost had stepped through the door. It took only minutes for the news to spread, and within an hour, Emily was in custody. I was told she froze at first, then shifted into denial, insisting there had been some mistake, and finally into anger when she realized the truth had caught up to her. The courtroom felt like a slow, painful storm. Investigators laid everything out: records of payments, messages, the guide's statement, the insurance inquiries. Each piece of evidence pushed the air heavier around us. I watched my grandchildren sitting together on the bench, holding on to each other, trying to understand how the person they trusted could do something so dark. Their confusion hurt more than anything else. When the verdict came, there was no sense of victory, only a quiet, aching finality. I realized then that justice doesn't heal the parts of you that were broken along the way. It simply closes a door you never wanted to walk through. And as I stepped outside the courthouse, I understood that surviving all of this came with a cost I am only beginning to grasp, leading me toward the reflection I knew I still owed myself and them. There are moments now, in the quiet of early morning, when I let myself feel everything I tried to outrun. The fear, the betrayal, the grief. They still rise and fall in me like a slow tide. But so does something else, the reminder that I survived. I learned the hard way that family is not defined by blood alone, but by the people who choose honesty, compassion, and accountability. Losing the daughter I thought I had will always hurt. Yet the truth freed me from a kind of darkness I didn't realize I was living in. Healing is slow. Some days, it feels like I am stitching myself back together, one breath at a time. But I know now that my worth was never tied to someone else's choices. I can rebuild. I can rest. I can move toward a life shaped by peace instead of fear. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've lived through something that changed the way you see family or trust, I hope you'll share it below. I read every comment, and I value the connection we find in each other's stories.